Hi Foxes, and welcome back to my channel. Thank you so much for joining me today. I feel like it's been forever since I've done one of these sit down videos, but here I am. Yeah, so I wanted to do a Q&A video. I had wanted to do this since I hit about 1,000 subscribers, and I hit that I think a couple of months ago, but here we are. And I polled Instagram, I polled YouTube to see if you guys had any questions about selling vintage or just vintage Q&A, and yeah, I got some responses and I want to go through and read those to you and then answer them. So if you like that kind of content, if you like content about vintage, if you like content about reselling, then go ahead and hit the subscribe button and make sure to give me a thumbs up. I do appreciate that. Yeah, so we're just gonna go ahead and get started with the first question. So the first question is, what websites do you use for research? And I have to be honest with you guys, I don't research as much as I used to, for the most part because I don't need to. Once you hit a certain point, I've been reselling vintage for over 8 years now, and once you hit a certain point, you kind of know the eras that you're looking at, and you've kind of learned that most vintage labels don't really have too much history behind them that's discoverable. A lot of vintage labels were very small labels. They were little outfits out of, individualized towns. They were sold at department stores, but they have like 3 different tags on them. And for the most part, unless it's like a well-known designer, it doesn't really add anything to the value, so doing research on it is not especially productive with your time. So once you sort of get all of that knowledge, you don't do quite as much research, but when I do need to do research, I definitely check the Vintage Fashion Guild. If you've never gone to their website before, I highly recommend it. They do have a lot of like articles and information on vintage clothing, but they also have a label resource where they go through many designers and they will post the label for the designer through the ages. So for example, I had a Marimekko blouse that I thought was vintage, but I went ahead and went to the Vintage Fashion Guild before posting it as vintage, and I looked through their label resource, and it didn't match up with any of the labels that they had posted. So I went and did some further research. I figured out what the print name was with Google. Then I started to do some searching through, I use Google image search a lot to sort of find a match for what I'm looking for, because a lot of times, like if you find something similar and it's sold on Etsy, it's not going to come up in the main search results, but it might be cataloged through the image results. So I do use Google Images a lot. So I found, the print name and another person who had a piece with the exact same print. It was a different piece, but it had the same print. It was in Finnish, I think. So I translated it from Finnish to English. The date on it was 2011. So I went ahead and did some more research into that, and the name that was on the label, the guy was only active in designing for Marimekko with that label from 2003 to 2008. So you can kind of do a little bit of research that way with Google. And then Etsy is actually another place that I do research. So I will search out what I'm looking for, and if I find anything that's, similar, or I find the same designer label, I'll often click on that item and then read their description, because sometimes they've done the research for you, and occasionally people will put a little bit of information about the designer in the description, and that's always helpful when it can help you narrow down what you're looking for and find more information on that particular piece. So yeah, just Google and the Vintage Fashion Label resource, and then if I'm really stumped, there's actually Facebook groups that I am a part of that can help you date vintage or find out more about it. The caveat to that is that you have to have done your research first. You can't just post your stuff there and be like, tell me about this. You have to have tried to look it up. But they are a wealth of knowledge, and they can sometimes help you figure out like the fabric content and, you know, what exact era the piece is from based on like minute details that you might not have picked up on previously. I'll put the name of that group down in the comments below in case you want to go and find it. Next question. Can you do a YouTube video with lots of fixes for fixing vintage things? So I actually used to have a series called Mend It Monday on Instagram where I would do a lot of these little fixes, show you how to, you know, repair chiffon or mend a hole in a sweater, stuff like that. And I really enjoyed doing them. Eventually I kind of ran out of project pieces, so I didn't have anything to show, and then it kind of tapered off. But if you are interested, you can go and check out my Instagram. It is SHOPFOXBURROW, and my children are pounding at the door to get in. It is SHOPFOXBURROW, and if you go to my IGTV, then I do have a series called Mend It Monday, and you can see what I've posted there. Question number 3. What first got you into vintage? I actually don't really remember any specific catalyst for getting into vintage. Well, what got me into fashion was Project Runway. I used to have basically no sense of fashion whatsoever. I bought everything on the clearance racks at stores, and like Forever 21 and Charlotte Russe and stuff like that. And in college I was on like a ridiculous budget. I think I had like $300 a month to live on or something like that. So I didn't really buy a lot of clothing. My family wasn't particularly into fashion, but at some point I started watching Project Runway in college with my friends, and then it wasn't until like many years later when I had a little bit more money that I started to challenge myself to dress up and not down for a full year. And I needed to get clothing for that, so I started doing thrifting, and it was actually a little bit easier to find vintage pieces at that time, 8 years ago, because there were fewer vintage sellers in my area, and so I was able to find them pretty easily, and I just kind of fell in love from there. And yeah, flea markets. I started going to flea markets around here and estate sales, stuff like that, and just sort of fell in love with the quality and the uniqueness of all of the different pieces. And yeah, I kind of never looked back. I do enjoy some modern clothing lines as well, but for the most part, I just think vintage is typically better made and more original. So next up is, what are some of your favorite vintage shops that you've ever visited? And I have to be honest with you and say I don't visit a lot of vintage shops. Part of the reason for that is that they are charging the same prices as I would be for vintage garments, sometimes more. So it's not really a good sourcing opportunity for me. There is a little vintage shop in Peterborough, New Hampshire that I love called the Melamine Cup, and she does a lot of like estate sale clear outs and stuff. She just has a really quirky eye for style. It's mostly housewares. I don't really find too much in the way of clothing there, but I do just love going in there and shopping, and I can always find something. And then the Garment District in Boston, Massachusetts is a pretty fun vintage shop, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention another local favorite of mine, Modern Millie. They are in Salem. She doesn't have as much vintage anymore. She mostly does like reproduction stuff now, but when I first started going there, she had like a rack of vintage. People could bring in their vintage for consignment. But now they primarily are kind of like a walk-in mod cloth, and I absolutely adore them. The owner is so sweet. All of the people who work there are so sweet. If you're not following them on Instagram, you definitely should. Modern Millie Vintage, I believe. And they do ship within the US. They might ship international as well, but just the selection that they get in, it's really great. And so not a vintage store so much anymore, but definitely has that vintage aesthetic, and one of the places I always love to go to when I am in Salem. Next question was, where do you source your vintage, and has it changed during quarantine? So yes, for sure. Right now, Brimfield should be happening, and if you didn't know, Brimfield is one of the largest flea markets in the country. It spreads out over multiple fields, over multiple days, and it kicks off, well, we kick it off at the Sturbridge Host Hotel. Has a vintage fashion and textile show every year, I think 3 times a year, but we usually go in May when everyone is sort of fresh with their vintage hoard that they've, you know, accumulated from estate sales and shopping over the winter. And we go and check that out, and I usually have a really big haul to bring back to my shop, and it was canceled this year. Brimfield was completely canceled this year. So normally I would be shopping at my local flea market, which is always a gem for, you know, cool vintage stuff. I would be shopping at Brimfield and do a mega haul there. I usually spend like over $1,000 just picking up vintage pieces for my shop. And then of course estate sales, which are all canceled right now as well. My favorite vintage honey hole has been permanently closed due to this pandemic, and then I guess it wasn't doing great to begin with. So yeah, vintage sourcing has definitely changed for me. The next question was an interesting one. It's, what do you write in your descriptions when you can't specifically date a piece to a particular era? And I would say that generally most pieces can be dated by style and by construction, even if they don't have tags. But the pieces that I'm just not able to date, I'll usually just say this vintage piece, or I'll say something like, this piece is most likely from the 1970s, but doesn't have any identifying tags or markings, so I cannot be 100%. And that usually tends to satisfy most people, and in those cases where, you know, I truly believe something is vintage, but I can't specifically prove it, some of the things I like to do is to just show the inside seams so that people really know what they're getting, show any closures so that buyers aren't surprised. I've definitely bought some things in the past that, you know, the seller says that they're 50s and they're 50s style, but when I get it, it's very obviously an 80s piece because it has a nylon zipper and a smocked back. You know, it's very clear. So if you just show all of those different elements to the piece, and you're just very upfront about what they're getting, and you just put in that you think it might be a certain era, I find that that's usually enough for most buyers, even solid vintage buyers. The next question is, and I'm going to read this one, do you recommend a generalized reminder or disclaimer about the condition of vintage, or a specific list of the issues? Generally, I tend to do a specific list of the issues, but if something is very obviously like distressed and worn, like a pair of vintage Levi's, you know, I will just put in distressed vintage condition, or note only like the most major things, like a large hole in the knee, or back pocket is coming undone, or Levi's tag is coming off the back or cracking or something like that. If it is like a vintage dress, I might put in like specific, if it has specific tears or things that need to be fixed, I will note them. But if I'm selling it as like a project piece, I will only note like the biggest things and say there may be other small issues that I did not spot. But for the most part, I don't recommend putting in like a general disclaimer about, you know, the condition of vintage being old, or there might be spots that I didn't find, or etc., because it kind of degrades the confidence that the buyer might have in your honesty. So in general, I prefer to list out as many of the flaws as I can. You are sort of limited if you sell on Poshmark by how much you can fit into your description, and I've definitely had that problem before where I want to list multiple flaws, But to do that, I have to basically take away the rest of the description. So I word it as best I can to make it very clear that there are flaws. Try and show it in the pictures, and then just, you know, answer any questions that they might have in the comments, because you can only fit so much in. Okay, so the next question was actually, how do you get rid of vintage smell? So if you've ever been vintage shopping, especially if you've ever been to estate sales, stuff that's been stored for a really long time, like 30 or more years, really does not smell good. It does not smell fresh. So there are a couple of tricks that I've learned over the years. The first is, if the garment can be washed, then to wash it. Dry cleaning is usually not going to get that smell out. So we'll start with the ones that can be washed. So if you can wash the garment, then soak in OxiClean for 24 to 48 hours is gonna be your best bet. So you do want to make sure that things on the garment can't rust. Sometimes vintage sequins will disintegrate because they're made out of gelatin. So you do have to be really careful about soaking stuff in OxiClean. But let's just say that you have like a nylon nightgown or a cotton dress. You can soak that in OxiClean for 24 to 48 hours. I would replace the OxiClean water after about the first 4 hours and then give it another overnight soak. And that is because a lot of the like surface dirt is going to come off in the first 4 hours or so, and then after that you want to get like that really deep soak. So I do a pretty heavy concentrate of OxiClean. Sometimes it doesn't even all dissolve, especially if you can't use warm water, if you're using cold water because you don't want something to shrink like rayon. And then once that comes out of the wash and is rinsed, then I will usually hang it outside to dry. There's nothing quite like line dried clothing to kind of get rid of that smell. You can also, if it's just not working, you can give it another rinse or another wash. Blue Dawn is a great cutter of all dirt and grease and stuff. And then you can add vinegar into the rinsing water and just like let it sit for an hour or two in the vinegar water. And then again, line dry it outside. Especially in sunshine. Sunshine is really going to help. You kind of learn, you know, in cloth diapering groups and stuff like that, if you are ever someone who does that, that they will like sun their diapers outside and it gets rid of, like, the sun kind of cleans them and whitens them. So the sun is a great cleaner. Don't underestimate it. If you cannot wash the item, vodka. So cheap vodka in a spray bottle, spray it on. You can put the item in the freezer. That can sometimes help. You can sun it outside, but you don't want to leave it out for so long that it gets any kind of fading. But yeah, just a cheap spray bottle with vodka can often help get rid of funky smells. So I hope that was helpful. This is a really good question. It is, can you date an item by the country that it was produced in? So if you have an item that was made, that is clearly vintage and it does have a country manufacturer on the tag, you can use that to help date certain clothing. So say that it is made in the British colony of Hong Kong, like that's what it says on the label, or it's made in, it says West Germany or East Germany, or it is, usually is West Germany, or it is made in, let's see, what's another one, the Republic of Korea or Japan. A lot of times those labels are going to be places that have been renamed. So if it is not a country that, yeah, so for example, Hong Kong is not a British colony anymore, and the Republic of North Korea, or the Republic of Korea, is just called South Korea now. So you can actually use those sort of terms to date when, like a range for when a garment was produced. So 2 questions left. The next one I'm actually thinking about doing a video for because it is a lot of information dump, I guess. It is all about what do you do for sizing when you're listing vintage, like particularly on Poshmark or on Etsy, where they have the item has vintage sizing or it has no sizing, and you need to get your item in front of the buyer that it will fit best. Modern sizing. So typically with a vintage piece, I will just use extra small, small, medium, large, extra large, 1X, 2X. And so not using the numerical system. Even if the garment has a numerical label, unless it is late 80s, 90s, or beyond. The reason for that is that vintage sizing is not at all like modern sizing, as vintage sizing is usually about 4 to 6 sizes behind modern sizing. So usually I will just list the item under, say for example, small, and then I will put the specific measurements in the listing, and next to the measurements I will say marked a vintage size 12. And then I'll show pictures of all the labels and stuff like that. And most people who are looking for vintage are going to be familiar with that vintage sizing not matching up. I have not had any returns based on vintage sizing because I provide measurements in all of my listings. And the last question, I saved this one for last because you will see, it is how do you price your vintage? And I have 3 methods for pricing vintage. There is the 6.5 method, the retail method, and then the comps method. And I have a whole video about that, which I'll link up here, so you can go ahead and check that out. Hopefully you can just click on over and watch that video, and then you will have 3 solid methods for pricing your vintage. So that is it. That is the questions that you guys submitted to me about selling vintage, and I hope that this video had some information in it that was useful to you in some way. I will link down below some of the references that I made in this video, and yeah, I hope that you will continue to tune in. And these are weird times that we are in, and right now I am just focusing on trying to do 1 video a week. My next video will probably be more of like a style and fashion focused video, but I hope to do more vintage content sometime in the near future, and I will see you there. Bye!